байна. Үржин үү? 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 Тэг өөрчлөлт хэлсэн. Тэг. Та сайн хийж байгаа. Зэц. 1 2 3 1 2 3
Oh, okay, we're ready. All right. Well, hello. Been asked today to talk a little bit about terrorism and how the United States and Mongolia can cooperate to combat the international scourge of terrorism. As you know, President Bush was here last year, November, the first time an American president had visited. He devoted quite a bit of his time and attention to counterterrorism, to discussing with Mongolia how our two countries can cooperate against terrorism. I think we all agree that peace, freedom, and democracy are very, very important, and we see Mongolia as a role model for democracies in this part of the world. We also like to say that democracies make the best neighbors because they're the most peaceful. In terms of terrorism, let me just define it, if I can, what it is and what it isn't. Terrorism has existed for a long time. It hit the United States in a big way, I should say, on September 11th, 2001. But even before that, we had terrorists back into the 60s and 70s, including in the United States. A terrorist group or terrorism is a criminal activity, and it's an act that is perpetrated against innocent civilians for political reasons, largely. So it's, in a sense, it's a declaration of war against innocent civilians and the use of violence against innocent civilians for political purposes. I just want to make sure that we distinguish terrorism from dissent and from separatism. We've seen around the world, particularly here in Mongolia these days, you have a lot of demonstrators, people who are demonstrating peacefully, expressing their political views peacefully. That is dissent, that is democracy, that is not terrorism. You also have, I know from time to time, perhaps in part of the country, some talk about separatism. I know this has been part of your political history. Again, separatism is not terrorism, as long as they don't resort to violence against innocent civilians. So I just want to make sure that we understand the distinction between honest dissent and terrorism. They're very different things. Following the attacks on the World Trade Center in the United States, September 11th, 2001, Mongolia was one of the first countries to express its sympathy and also its support for a U.S.-led, if you will, through the United Nations attack on terrorism. Mongolia has signed, I believe, all 12 of the United Nations conventions against terrorism. This was requested by the UN of all members, that all the countries sign these 12 UN conventions. I would just note, though, that in several cases, while Mongolia has signed the conventions, you have not yet ratified them or in some cases implemented them. And I would just point out that one of the most important things any country can do, in addition to denying terrorists freedom in their country or a base in their own country, is to deny terrorists the use of their banks. We have asked Mongolia, and Mongolia is right now, the state Great Hural, is considering a money laundering bill. This would put restrictions on the ability of terrorists and criminals to wash their money, their illegally obtained money, in Mongolian banks. So we think this piece of legislation, we call it the anti-money laundering law. Should also be a separate and strong anti-terrorist financing law. So these are two very important pieces of legislation and implementation that we have been encouraging Mongolia now for about 3 years to implement, so that you can help stop the financing, make it impossible for terrorists to use Mongolia to finance operations in other parts of the world. So that's a very important element of it. In fact, we have somebody from the Department of Treasury coming next month to talk further to Mongolia about this. Another area that we have been seeking cooperation with Mongolia is what we call the Proliferation Security Initiative. We are concerned that terrorists have an ability, or they should not, we try to prevent them from obtaining weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons. So we've asked countries to join with us in efforts to stop the proliferation and also to prevent the transport of weapons of mass destruction. And in particular, since Mongolia actually registers ships, you have a ship registry organization or enterprise, we have asked Mongolia to join us and other countries in signing a shipboarding agreement, what we call the Proliferation Security Initiative, which will enable us to interdict or stop any suspect shipments of illegal materials or materials that might be used for weapons of mass destruction. So again, this is another issue that we have raised with your government and asked for your support. I think the best example of where the U.S. and Mongolia have cooperated very effectively is in the peacekeeping, the international peacekeeping. This is not just against terrorism, it's against, it's to promote stability and democracy around the world. And as President Bush has said, we're very thankful, very appreciative that the Mongolian people continue to support peacekeeping operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And beyond that, you now have peacekeepers in Sierra Leone, in Kosovo, and in many other countries. This is not directly related to terrorism, it's related more to peacekeeping and peace support. But where needed, Mongolia has generously stepped forward to support that, and we will be continuing to work with you on peacekeeping operations. In terms of overall relations, let me just, I hope, finish on a high note. I think today U.S.-Mongolia relations, at least from my perspective, is at its highest point. Not only just because President Bush visited, but I think that's significant. He visited because he realized that this was a very high point in our relations. So it's not the end. Let's just say his visit started the beginning of what I think will be a very new era in our comprehensive partnership. And cooperation against terrorism will be one of those key elements in our relationship.